What I have here is a very short extract from the end of the appendix in part 1 of Spinoza's Ethics. And I've said it before, but the appendix is almost a book in its own right, actually. There's so much truth and depth in it. Anyway, I'll read it. He, she, it lacked not material for creating all things, from the highest to the lowest degree of perfection. You have to remember, I've put the he, she, it bit there. Spinoza just said he. Spinoza was bound in his day to pay some lip service to religious stuff. He would have been hung, drawn and quartered, and he was fairly near to that anyway. So, he was just really paying a bit of lip service by saying God is a he, which is as annoying to me as I'm sure it is to many other people. Anyway, he lacked not material for creating all things, from the highest to the lowest degree of perfection. So, to put it into more contemporary terms, in the universe there are no restrictions on the things that are created in the whole. In the whole of existence, there are no restrictions. What could possibly restrict it? Not something outside of existence, because then you wouldn't be talking about the whole of existence. So there are no constraints. So nature or God is free to create anything at all. And in human eyes, those things might range from the utterly repulsive and grotesque through to the most sublime. And that is the way it is. Now, there is a sense of objectivity in this, because what Spinoza is saying here is from the highest to the lowest degree of perfection. So it's not as though, basically a pile of dog turds is equivalent to the cathedral at Chartres near Paris. It's not, for reasons I'll get onto. An interesting story here, actually, because I've mentioned before many times that there are great similarities between Spinoza and Zen and Taoism. And in Zen it's said the only thing that stops a person from being enlightened, another horrible word, but the only thing is the habit of choosing one thing over another, of having preferences. I knew some Zen people very well, and they lived in a very nice place in Sonoma County in California. And I said, you've chosen this place over living in a slum somewhere, haven't you? No, we haven't, no. I'm not really criticizing them, I'm very grateful to them, but everybody has their little things that they can't get over, and they just couldn't be honest enough to say, well, yes, we like it here. It's far preferable to living in a slum in some overcrowded city. Anyway, this little quote from Spinoza answers so many questions. You wouldn't think so, but hopefully you'll see that by the end of this. So as far as human beings are concerned, and let's remember the word perfection means power. The power for what? The power for existence. So we appreciate things on 3 levels, intellectual, emotional and physical. I'll qualify the emotional one in a minute, because that really belongs to the other 2. It's a very deep story here. I don't know how long this is going to go on. So, at an intellectual level, then watching a game show, people get a little bit engaged with that. Oh, is he going to get the right answer, or is he going to figure out the puzzle, or whatever? But it's not all that kind of satisfying, is it really? But if someone struggles for 5 years to understand, I don't know, Spinoza or Kant or Einstein or something of that nature, an intellectual pursuit, then slowly but surely the power of the ideas increases. And let me define what power is in an idea. Power in an idea, and remember that ideas are composed of lots of little ideas. Ideas are just like things. The more intricate the structure, and the more that structure is solid and things fit together, the more power it has, because it will be more, each part reinforces the other part, so it has more persistence. It's harder to break apart. It has more existence. So, speaking from my own experience, and I've mentioned this before, you'll get sick of hearing it at some point, but for my degree I did a theoretical physics degree. I didn't want to be messing around with oscilloscopes and stuff like that, so it was purely theoretical. And in the final year we were given a proof of Einstein's special relativity using tensor calculus. Of course that was a summation of 3 years work for my degree, and I remember it to this day. And in fact it wasn't just me, a couple of people. We walked out and we just said, I've never seen anything like that before. The beauty and elegance of the ideas was breathtaking, and to this day that has still ruined me. The only thing that comes near is Spinoza and Kant. I'll get onto that later too. But if you've pursued that level of intellectual inquiry with that intensity and that level of effort, then an idea is formed in your mind that it has a very potent existence. And then we come to physical things like say a gymnast at the Olympic Games. You know, I have no interest in sport whatsoever. I qualify that. If I see something extraordinary, then yeah, it moves me just as much as anybody else. But you know, to watch some of these gymnasts at the Olympic Games is awe-inspiring. You can see the training and the finesse, each movement even from the fingers through to the rest of their body, all working together, all coordinated, all finely tuned. It's a magnificent structure in terms of the movements and the skills involved. And then we get to emotions. Now, as you know, Spinoza says the emotions are in the body. And this is one point where we could, or I could, move very, very far away from what Gurdjieff talks about, the emotional center. But if we say emotions are in the body, then basically there are things, and music is a very good example, that excite our intellect and our body together. So again, in my own experience, there are certain pieces of Bach. I think it's the toccata in F, the organ. Every time I listen to it, I get goosebumps, and my mind gets lost in it. The structure and the beauty of it does that to me every time. Again, we're talking about structure. So the intellect is satisfied and the body is satisfied as well. The body senses the intricacy of all this music. And so, you know, I get an emotion which is, you know, for me, tearful. I'm just so moved by it all. You know, there's nothing sad in that piece of music. Quite the opposite. So, the emotions, and this is where we go back to Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff said that the higher emotional and intellectual centers are really one. So we get to a point where intellectual effort can produce emotions of a very high order. And they're not the usual emotions, they're not concerned with survival, in the normal sense anyway. Because if you remember what I've said about emotions in previous podcasts, and particularly with reference to part 3 of the Ethics, where Spinoza is basically painting, the picture of hell that we're all familiar with, a very low level of emotion, ordinary emotions, everyday emotions, envy, hatred, excitement, love in the sense of pleasure, and so on. Then those emotions are at one level, but there's another kind of emotion that's tied to intellect. And people who are primarily emotional may not like that statement, but I've found that to be true in my experience. And yeah, there's a lot I could say about that, but I want to get on with this. So we have an inbuilt ability to appreciate different levels of perfection, power. And let me just talk about that power thing again. As far as intellectual things and physical things are concerned, it's the structure of the thing that we're talking about, the complexity and the way it all hangs together. I don't necessarily mean complexity in terms of a jumbled mess. I mean complexity in terms of the elegance and the power of the idea. Hard to explain, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So this answers a number of questions. So why is there suffering on earth? Well, because God had no reason not to create suffering, is the obvious answer. If suffering was an outcome from some laws or some nature of manifestation, then suffering was going to be there. There's a famous conversation between a Zen master and his student. The student says, what is the reason for so much suffering? And the Zen master said, no reason. And this is kind of the similarity between Spinoza and Taoism and Zen. The answers are kind of obvious, but hard to understand and accept in some ways. So the reason we have so much suffering is because God was not inhibited in any kind of way, or nature was not inhibited in any kind of way when things were created, and so there was no reason for it not to create suffering. And suffering of the most horrific kinds you can imagine. Those things are not prohibited. As Spinoza says in the Theological Political Treatise, nature does not frown on anything that is possible, because it has the resources to create anything which, in our eyes, might be truly grotesque and foul, through to the sublime. Now, it may have already occurred to you, and it might not have as well, that we have a choice here in terms of where we place our attention, because the whole universe is constructed from, or produces things that range from the grotesque and the terrible through to the sublime and the wonderful. So where are you going to put your attention? Because if you keep your attention on the grotesque and the terrible, those things that have very little power, very little structure, if you keep your attention there, then that's all you're going to see. And you are not going to gain power from that. You personally will not gain power by consuming low power impressions and low power ideas. The way that you gain power is by consuming ideas and impressions and thoughts that have a great deal of inner power. And I'll remind you again, just in case you keep forgetting, power equals cohesive structure. There's more power in the human body than there is in that of a worm, because it's far more complex and it coordinates in a far more powerful way than that of a worm. A worm can basically wiggle about in the dirt. That's about it. We can build airplanes. We can perform gymnastics. We can create beautiful scientific theories and mathematics. So it makes sense to put your attention where the power is. It isn't being heartless to ignore the grotesque and ugly, which in grotesque and ugly for us is typically where there's no power. To ignore those things is not some act of heartlessness. It's just an act of preserving your being when you don't look at those things, because they diminish you. So this is where we have to, and you may or may not remember the podcast I did, I don't know, 3 or 4 podcasts ago about common notions. We need to find things that reinforce us, things that are not only in sympathy with our nature, but things that can possibly or might enhance our nature by consuming things that have more power. The problem is that to consume things of low power requires no effort on our part. You know, you can sit and watch game shows all day. Zero power in that kind of thing. You can, I don't know, annihilate yourself with alcohol all day. That requires no power. But to study Spinoza or Kant or Schopenhauer to some extent, Plato, yeah, obviously I'm quoting the things that I have a preference for, but you can find your own things that have power. Maybe if you're into music, you study Bach or Palestrina or whoever, or play those things. And if you're a physical kind of person, maybe you acquire greater skill in, I don't know, Tai Chi or Judo or martial art or whatever. But those things require effort. So there's the signature of whether you are consuming something of greater power or less power. If you're consuming something of greater power, it will require effort to digest it. If you're consuming something of low power, no effort is required, because nothing is actually digested. You know, you'll watch one game show and then move on to the next one. So this little statement from Spinoza that the universe can manifest anything that it wants to. Want is not a good word for it, but the universe manifests every level of perfection or power. And this is a very strong theme in the Gurdjieff work, that we deliberately choose the things that we consume, because, well, I'll very quickly go into a little bit of Gurdjieff's cosmology. Basically, we too are consumed. That shouldn't come as a surprise. This is Gurdjieff's everything eats everything else philosophy. So if all you've lived on all your life is the equivalent of donuts, then by the time you die, your psyche is going to resemble a donut. However, if you've lived all your life on, I don't know, very nutritious, refined foods, then by the time you come to die, maybe there's something actually quite refined and elaborate within you. And at that point, you will either go to heaven or hell. And there's a whole story there. I don't mean them literally, of course. But anyway, that's long enough. So, I've said it before, but the appendix in part 1 is worth reading over and over and over again.